good. No, still stressed.
So over the summer, I worked at an Italian marketplace called Larisha's. And this had been my first time ever working at a deli. I was hesitant about it because I didn't know anyone who worked there, nor did I even know how to use a meat slicer. But I got the job and made some pretty solid relationships, especially with the owners. But one day I was in the kitchen with Tessa, who is one of the owners, and she started to open up to me about her aunt who lived in California but was battling cancer right now. And this lady, she talked about her all the time, and from what she had said, I could tell that she was a faithful woman, and she's just a light of Christ. Well, I didn't know what to do in that moment when she told me she was battling cancer, and I didn't think she was going to live much longer, so I just prayed with her and her husband Michael in the kitchen. A few days later, I found out that her aunt had passed, and her family began to question God. They began to question why he would take someone so faithful away from this earth, and somebody that they loved. And so, sometimes we forget that things don't go the way we always expect them to go. Our prayers were actually answered because we prayed for healing, just not in the way that we wanted it to be done. But we had faith in God and His power, and He answered our prayers because she was healed. And the disciples went through a similar situation when they were trying to heal a boy who was demon-possessed. They had to learn that it wasn't about the amount of faith, but about their faith in God's power and His will, just as Tessa and Michael had to learn. So if you want to open up your Bibles to Matthew 17, we're going to be reading verses 14 through 20 today. And it says this: When they came to the crowd, a man came to him, knelt before him, and said, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic, and he suffers terribly. He often falls into fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him." And Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him here to me." And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was cured instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "Because of your little faith. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for this opportunity to just share your word, God. I just pray that you use me as a vessel to relay this message of faith, God, and how the disciples dealt with it and how we should be dealing with it as well. And looking to you and your power and your will for our lives, God, I just pray that you open up our hearts and our minds to what you have to offer right now. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. So this story in Matthew starts out with Jesus and his three closest disciples coming down from the mountain, approaching a crowd, when a man comes up to Jesus and kneels before him saying, "Lord, have mercy on my son." Although we don't know who this man is, we can draw some conclusions about him. When he approaches Jesus, he kneels at his feet. And then he calls him Lord, asking him to have mercy. Well, these things show that this is a man of faith. Now, he probably had heard or seen what Jesus could do and had done, and he believed in the power that Jesus had. And so this man is approaching Jesus because his son, he's doing this in regards to his son who is sick. He says that he is an epileptic. But little did he know that this boy was actually demon-possessed. When he brought him to the disciples, they weren't able to heal him. And so he goes to the true miracle worker, Jesus. When the man tells Jesus that the disciples were unable to cure his son, Jesus responds with, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you, and how much longer must I put up with you?" Well, these seem to be extremely harsh words, especially from Jesus. Well, in this moment, he was frustrated, not just with the disciples and their unbelief, but also the crowd of people. When Jesus calls them faithless and a perverse generation, he is pointing out and acknowledging that they, the disciples and the people as a whole, have not put their faith in him as the Messiah, and that their view of him has become distorted. This most likely was a result of ignoring the demand that Jesus expressed in repenting alongside the influences they had of the religious leaders. Then Jesus continues with these two questions that reaffirm his place on earth as temporary, looking forward to the day he returns to heaven, recognizing that the world will not fully turn to him in what he has to offer. Right after all of this, he calls for the boy to be brought to him. He rebukes the demon, and the boy is cured immediately. Well, Jesus has done miracles, and he's rebuked demons, and has healed many people before this encounter in Matthew. Jesus even gives the disciples the authority and power to continue his ministry prior to this in Matthew 10. And the disciples should have been able to perform this miracle through the power of Jesus, but they could not. Why? Well, the disciples asked the same question. In verse 19, they asked Jesus in private, they say, "Why could we not cast it out?" They knew that they had the authority and power to do this, and they have performed the same miracle before, but something was different. When Jesus uses the phrase little faith, he doesn't mean a total lack of faith. He means that they had a weak faith, which would produce the same outcome of having no faith at all. The disciples do have faith in Jesus, though, and in the mission that he has sent them out to do, but could not perform this miracle. And so then we can ask the question of where were they putting their faith during this time? Well, the disciples' inability to perform this miracle has to do with where they placed their faith. And there were a few possible reasons for this. I mean, there was a huge crowd around them. The pressures could have been causing them to lose their focus and intentions and putting on a show for these people rather than doing God's will. Or they could have been relying on their own strength in this time and their own power instead of God's. Well, Jesus acknowledges this in them and tells them, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, nothing will be impossible for you. This is extremely significant because in their day and time, the mustard seed was the smallest thing that they had and could comprehend. He affirms earlier in chapter 13 that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. So the disciples understood this visualization of how much faith they needed. And is saying here in 17 that with just this small amount, there is an unlimited potential in the signs of the kingdom the disciples were given the authority to perform through God's power that aligns with the will of God. But their faith doesn't stop with the mustard seed. In chapter 13, Jesus says that the mustard seed is, the smallest of the seeds, but it also grows into the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree. So it doesn't stop at the seed and the seed-sized faith, but it's to let our faith grow into this magnificent tree and become even stronger. Their faith was weak in the area of trusting the power of God, the power that made every miracle possible. With just a small amount of faith in the power of God, anything is possible according to his will. This is exactly what Matthew was intending to focus on when he wrote this story. The miracle that Jesus performed was great, and the crowd was amazed by what he had done. But Matthew focuses on the faith that the disciples needed in the power of God in order to do the will of God. After we read this passage, we can now ask, well, how does this relate to us? Times are different. We don't go around and see crowds coming up to us, asking us to take a demon out of someone's child. But we can relate to how the disciples felt and what they were thinking and doing. We might be asking God why our sermons aren't effective or our prayers aren't being answered. We have faith in God and in the mission that he has for us, but things aren't going as they should be going or how we want them to go. And so it's easy for us today to get distracted on why we are doing something. We have to look at this story and ask ourselves, are we doing this for the will of God, placing our faith in his power, or are we here to please people, giving them what they want to hear? We need the same reminder that the disciples received. With a small amount of faith in the power of God, anything is possible according to his will. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for this story and how we can learn from the disciples and their mistakes, and also from ours as we look at our lives, God. I just pray that we remember that all we need is just a little bit of faith, God. And it's in faith with your power and your will, God, that we can perform miracles. miracles here on earth. It's in your name we pray. Amen.